Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. We are also running a competition at the moment, so if you've got a short story, please go to theshortstoryworkshop.com/competition and you can find all the details there. We'd love to read your stories. I'm here with Matt and Simone. This week's story is The Mermaid of Druid Lake by Charles Weathers Bump, which is a great name. I really like saying it. I picked this story. I liked it because it was just a fun little romance. It had a mermaid in it, and I'm just a sucker for mermaids, I guess. So
we'd never have guessed. I think you've done all of the mermaid stories on this podcast.
You picked The Little Mermaid, so you started it.
That's true. That's true. We're both guilty.
I've done most of the other mermaid-related stuff, though, so kind of guilty. But yeah, I thought this was a neat little story, and I have nothing else to say. I hope you enjoy it. Here is The Mermaid of Druid Lake by Charles Weathers Bump.
If Edwin Horton had not had a sleepless time that hot June night, it probably would never have happened. As it was, after tossing and pitching on an uncomfortably warm mattress for several hours, he had dressed himself and left his Bolton Avenue home for a stroll in Druid Hill Park, just as the dawn made itself evident. That was the beginning of the adventure. Not a soul was in sight when he reached the driveway round the big lake, and he let out to take a little vigorous exercise, breathing in the fresh air with more enjoyment than had been his for some hours. About halfway around he stopped suddenly and rubbed his eyes to make sure he was not dreaming, for a curve in the road had brought him the knowledge that he was not alone in his appreciation of the early morning hour. Seated beside the water, on the rocks that line the lake shore, was a damsel, a rather good-looking one, as well as he could judge at the distance of 100 yards. She was leaning on her left elbow and looking out over the lake in rather a pensive, dreamy attitude. Of course, young ladies don't ordinarily get up before dawn to go out to Druid Hill Park for the purpose of sitting alone beside the broad sweep of city water, and Edwin naturally felt some surprise at the novelty of the sight. Besides, she was inside the high iron railing, and he wondered how she had got there. In the intensity of his interest, he slowed down his pace as he drew nearer along the roadway. Should he watch her unobserved for a while to ascertain her purpose? Should he frankly hail her and ask whether she objected to company? Should he... Well, the damsel settled his doubts for him just then by discovering him. She appeared startled, and he fancied she half meant to plunge into the lake. Then she changed her mind, gave him a bewitching little smile, and raised her free hand to beckon him. Edwin needed no second invitation. The novelty of the situation was too alluring to resist. In another moment he had scaled the fence and was clambering awkwardly down the rocks. And as he came close, he found her a very pretty damsel indeed, with youthful rosy cheeks, fetching blue eyes, and long light tresses that hung unconfined from her head down upon the sloping rocks behind her. She was smiling, and yet he thought he detected a renewed disposition to slip away from him before he had drawn too close. Then he had a shock. She was only half a woman. The other half of her was fish, scaly fish, partly submerged in the waters of the lake. He paused irresolutely. It was all right, you know, to read about mermaids in old mythologies and fairy tales, but to encounter one in this year of our Lord, so near home as Druid Lake, oh fudge! The boys at the Aerial Club would never get through joshing him, should he ever say he had seen such a thing. It could not be true. It was too amazing. He was a fool to let his nerves get the better of him. He had better cut out those visits to the river resorts, or next he would be seeing pink elephants climbing trees. First thing he knew, he would wake up in that stuffy room at home. No, he couldn't be dreaming. There was the railing, and the lake, and the White Tower, and General Booth's home, and the Madison Avenue entrance, and the Wallace statue, and a dozen other familiar spots in a most familiar perspective. And there, too, was the damsel, in flesh and blood, or rather, flesh and fish. She was the first to speak. "Good morning to you, stranger." She spoke English, good, clear mother tongue. Her lips were parted in that alluring smile, and her manner was as saucy as that of any fair flirt he had ever known of womankind. "In the name of heaven, who are you?" he stammered, as he sat down awkwardly beside her. She laughed outright, mischievously, mockingly. I am the nymph of the lake. Long years ago I was the naiad of the woodland spring that is deep down yonder," indicating a spot out in the lake. "But they dammed me in, and turned great floods of water in here, and mighty Jupiter gave me my new title." "And are you really half fish?" She laughed again. I am what you see." As she spoke, she gracefully swayed the lower half of her in the water. A million glistening scales prismatically reflected the increasing morning light. She was half fish, all right. There was no doubt about that. "By gosh, here's a rum go," muttered Edwin to himself. "What did you say?" queried the mermaid. "I said, if you must know." "By Jove, you are a beauty," he replied, gallantly and impetuously. The mermaid smiled again. The feminine half of her was pleased with the compliment to her good looks. "I'm afraid you're a sad flatterer," she said coquettishly. She lowered her blue eyes, then uplifted the lashes and looked full into his face in a manner that made his heart bound. One little finger was shaken playfully at him. Edwin seized the hand. It was warm. Human blood pulsated through it, and as he held it, his companion gave just a bit of a squeeze. A score of girls had done the same in bygone sentimental hours, but none so deftly. "This is certainly an odd adventure," he remarked. "Tell me, Lady of the Lake, do you often sit here in this unconventional fashion with gentlemen callers?" "What would you give to know?" she asked teasingly. "You are the first for a long, long time," she went on. "Last summer there was a man in a grey uniform who saw me, but he looked so uninteresting I swam away." "When are you here?" he asked earnestly. "I love to sit on the bank when fair aurora makes the dawning day grow rosy," she acknowledged, "but I have to flee to the depths when the full sun comes." She looked to the east. "It is growing late," she added hurriedly. "I must be going." Not yet," he pleaded. "Do not detain me," she cried. "I must go. It means life to me." Gracefully she glided into the water at his feet. "You will come tomorrow?" he asked. The coquettish mood returned to her. "Perhaps," she said, as with long strokes she headed for the centre of the lake. Edwin watched intently until she had gone 100 yards and more. Then she ceased swimming, kissed her hand to him, and dived under it as a single word, "Farewell," floated over the water. He was in a trance that day. His father, at the breakfast table, jovially prodded him about being late, until he barely caught himself on the verge of telling his queer secret, and so absent-minded was he at the office that he found he had entered the count of a prosaic old firm as Mermaid and Nymph. Long before 4 a.m. the next day he was at the lake. The waning moon was still in the west, and there were few signs of the coming day. For half an hour he kept his vigil alone, and had almost begun to think his piscatorial charmer was not coming. Then suddenly he spied her out in the lake, swimming toward him. When about 50 yards offshore, she hailed him jovially and bade him go around to the White Tower. As he moved along the driveway, she kept him company, maintaining the pace with graceful, tireless strokes, and occasionally coming nearer to exchange a remark. "What made you change the trysting place?" he asked. "Love of change, I suppose," she replied. A water nymph does not get much chance at novelty. The half hour they spent upon the water's edge was largely one of sentimental banter between merry maid and enamoured man, in which Edwin reached the conclusion that his charmer could give cards to the jolliest little jollier in Baltimore. She asked him about his past and present girlfriends, and pouted deliciously when he frankly acknowledged them. Finally they parted. She promised to appear the next morning. The third meeting started a chain of events. They were comfortably chatting on the rocks when Edwin heard the chug-chug of an automobile. The mermaid clutched his arm in alarm. "What are those horrid things?" she naively remarked. "They often make such an awful fuss I can hear them down in my cosy corner." Edwin's reply was suspended while the machine passed them. The 2 men who were in it craned their necks most industriously at the sight of a pair of lovers out so early, and seated in such an unusual spot for sentimental couples. When he turned to make the explanation she had asked, he found it a harder task than he had imagined. Her knowledge of human inventions, of worldly means of locomotion, was not extensive, and he had to begin with the ABC of it and go through a course in elementary mechanics. After the 42nd paragraph of instructions, the damsel clapped her hands gleefully and cried, "It would be great fun to take a trip in one." "It is great fun," declared Edwin, for a moment forgetting to whom he was talking. "But then I couldn't do it," she exclaimed in disappointment. "I couldn't leave the lake." The unshed tears in her eyes made him ardent. "You could do it if you are willing," he avowed earnestly. "You can take the water with you." Visions of a tank lady in the greatest circus on earth came to him. "You are fooling me," murmured the mermaid, and she pouted. Edwin rose to the occasion. "I am not fooling," he protested. "It would not be difficult to put a tank of water in the machine for you to put your—" He was going to say feet, but he ended his sentence stumblingly. "Your other half in." In her joy, the Lady of the Lake took his cheeks in her hands and gave him an impulsive kiss. "You are the loveliest being on earth," she said enthusiastically. That settled it. The rest of the conversation that morning was about automobiles. and when they parted it was with a definite assurance on his part that Edwin would be on hand the next morning with a motor car suitably equipped for her use. It was only when he had gotten away that he realised the ridiculous side of the job he had undertaken. He could get an automobile all right. Tom Rees was a good friend, and a willing one, and his car had a tonneau capacious enough to accommodate the ex-Naiad and her movable pool. But he would have to tell Tom the whole peculiar adventure to get him to take his auto out at such an unearthly hour. He'll think me clean daft when I unfold it to him, said Edwin to himself. And Tom did too. He laughed loud and long when Edwin chose what he thought to be a propitious moment and began his confession. "What are you stuffing me with?" Tom demanded, with tears in his eyes. Edwin renewed his explanations, only to bring on another explosion. "You'll be the death of me yet, old fellow," asserted Tom. "You'd better cut out those absinthes." Edwin added details most earnestly. "You're crazy, boy," was the only reply he got. He grew angry and hurt. "Now, Tom Rees," he demanded, "have I ever failed you when you wanted my help?" Tom apologised and began to study Edwin with intentness. "Look here, Edwin Horton," he said. "If there is any such girl at Druid Lake as you described, she's a fake, and she's got you strung mightily." Edwin swallowed the stig at his intelligence peacefully. He saw he had won. "All I ask, Tom," he rejoined, "is that you will take me out in the car and see for yourself." Tom gave him his hand. "I'm from Missouri, and you'll have to show me," he chuckled. A wash tub from Mrs. Rees's cellar was requisitioned at 3 a.m. for use as a tank. After it had been lifted into the tonneau, a hose supplied the needed water. "Climb into the water wagon," ordered Tom, and he threw on the lever and spun out to Druid Hill Park. The day was still in embryo when the lake tower was reached, but the nymph was there. Her trim blue blouse was still wet after her swim ashore. The morning was summery, but Edwin had appreciated that the ride might be cold for the water lady, and had thoughtfully brought his sister's raincoat. Tom's astonishment at seeing a bona fide mermaid was balm to Edwin. The lads stood open-mouthed after Edwin had introduced them. In fact, he was so dumbfounded that he failed to notice the hand the damsel had extended to him. "Come on, Tom," said Edwin. "There isn't much time." One on each side, the two boys supported the nymph as she cavorted as gracefully as possible up the rocks. They hadn't thought of the iron railing. "Caesar's ghost," muttered Tom in dismay. "How are we going to get her over that?" Edwin turned to the mermaid. "If you don't mind," said he, "we will have to lift you." "I don't mind," she said simply, "if you don't drop me." At Edwin's suggestion, he clambered over first, and then Tom raised the young creature boldly until she was clear of the iron spikes. There Edwin took hold of her and carried her to the auto. She was not a heavy burden, but her wet condition and her combination shape increased the difficulties. From the moment she was once in the auto, her joy was a pleasure to observe. She began by expressing her delight at their thoughtfulness in supplying the wash-tub. When the machine began to move, she clapped her hands in childish glee. From glee to wonderment, her mood changed as they spun along the park roads. 100 naive questions were asked about the objects unfamiliar to a lady whose habitat was the bottom of a big pond. Edwin answered faithfully, and had his reward in his enjoyment of her artlessness and winsomeness. Occasionally Tom looked round to share in it. At a good clip, the auto was run out Park Heights Avenue and back. The dawn seemed most kindly disposed to the trio, for it was long in coming, and when they had reached Pimlico, Tom proposed a detour by way of Rowland Park to return to the lake across Cedar Avenue Bridge. The damsel hailed it with glee, only stipulating that she must be back by sun-up. They showed her the turf tracks on either side as they bowled along the Belvedere Avenue eastward, and they were still engaged in explaining to her the methods of horse racing when Tom started down the long hill beside the Tyson Place, Silburn, leading down to the bridge across Jones Falls. The girl was asking questions, with her bewitching face in close proximity to Edwin's, when there came a startling interruption to their fun. Tom, again greatly interested in the talk, failed to notice a large boulder in the road, and the auto shot over it with a jolt that caused him to lose control of the wheel. The big machine regained its balance but not its course. Instead it careened to the right and bumped into the ditch before the alarmed occupants had scarcely grasped their peril. Tom was tossed out on the roadway. Edwin was pitched into the front seat. The mermaid shot past him and fell on a clump of green turf, and the tub of water upset and, in seeking an outlet, poured over the car, drenching Edwin. "Look out for a gasoline explosion!" shrieked Tom, raising himself from the road, apparently unhurt. Edwin knew he could do nothing to prevent such a catastrophe, so he followed the other two out of the auto as quickly as he could. For a moment he and Tom paid no attention to the mermaid, so absorbed were they in the possibility of a blow-up, but when this danger had apparently passed they discovered that she had lifted herself from the grassy sward and was flip-flopping awkwardly in the direction of the brook runs through Silburn near the road. Come back, there's no danger," called Edwin as he started after her. The damsel paid no heed. She was intent on getting to that stream of running water. Again Edwin called, this time more sharply. The mermaid stopped not, but turned a tearful and much convulsed face to him. Edwin raced after her. So did Tom. But when they got to the edge of the brook, the only sign of her was an increasing ripple on the surface of a little pool. The stream was not so deep, but that the bottom could be studied, and yet they saw nothing of her. Evidently she had the enchanted gift of being invisible in water. Tom looked at Edwin. Edwin looked at Tom. "That beats the Dutch," said Tom. "It's worse than that," replied Edwin, an odd catch in his voice. "We certainly have queered her for good. We must find her, and get her back to the park somehow." For hours they moved up and down alongside the stream, calling pleadingly but without response for their quondam friend. Edwin made a little oration to her in absentia, in which he humbly begged her pardon, and swore by all the gods of Mount Olympus, by the great Jupiter, the chaste Diana, and all the rest of them, as far as he could remember their names, that he would restore her safely to the lake. But she came not. Tom added his entreaties, but she heeded not. Then Tom suggested that perhaps she had worked her way down the brook and into Jones Falls, whence she could, if she but knew the pipes, get into her beloved lake again. Edwin jumped at the idea and, leaving Tom to look after the auto, hastened down the ravine to Jones Falls, and moved up and down the falls, calling for the vanished damsel, with a fervour that might have caused doubt as to his sanity had anyone heard it. When he returned, terribly downcast, Tom had gotten the car righted, and had discovered that it was uninjured. "No luck, I suppose," said Tom. "No," replied Edwin moodily. "Get in then. We can't stay here all day." Edwin required urging to leave the spot. Finally he consented to go. As he climbed in, he saw the overturned washtub, and his concentrated wrath and grief were heaped upon it. Picking it up, he hurled it savagely at a tree, and when it fell to pieces with a concussion, he exclaimed vehemently and inconsequentially, "That's the blamed thing that got us into this muss." At Druid Lake he insisted on another long search. Time and again the auto was stopped, that he might call aloud for his charmer, but no answering sound came across the water. "Curses," said Edwin. "I'm afraid she's lost for good, and that is probably the true explanation as to why there has been no mermaid in Druid Lake since. She may be in Silburn Brook, she may be in Jones Falls, she may have reached the Patapsco, but no one has ever seen a creature answering her description and aquatic habits since the damsel who once held the job got giddy and went motoring."
So, what did you both think of the story? Let's start with Simone. What did you think?
I thought it was fun. A little silly. Not like, in-depth, deep, gonna stick for me forever. But fun. I had a good time.
Good. Yeah, that's what I like about it. It's just a bit of fluff, really, but what about you, Matt? What did you think of it?
Yeah, I would more or less agree. It's quite straightforward. I like how easily our poor protagonist is drawn in by this mermaid, and then how innocuously it goes wrong. It was quite amusing. And I particularly like the ending where it seems like the whole story was just an excuse for why there's no mermaid at this particular lake, which is just insane.
You mean you think there's an implication there's mermaids at other lakes?
Well, I mean, there's a much simpler answer of why is there no mermaid at this lake, because there aren't any mermaids.
How dare you?
I wonder why there's no mermaid here, and then someone has spun this elaborate tale just for the sake of it.
The only reasonable reaction really to have. Why is there not a mermaid in this lake?
Oh, well, you see, there used to be one, and then they got in a car and got driven away, and then they ended up in a stream, or was never seen again.
I hope that it's the case that she's happily swimming in a stream somewhere and she didn't just die. I mean, there's nothing in the text to say she'll die apart from the fact she seems not to really want to be around for very long in the morning.
I mean, I guess as long as she's in the water by sundown, she's all good.
Okay, I want a happy ending for the mermaid. Well, a happy-ish ending. I hope she's not too lost. She just decided, I'm not going back to that lake. Weird people will put you in cars or something. Okay, so I think a key part of the story is how a romantic interest between the mermaid and I've forgotten the protagonist's name.
Does he have a name? Edwin.
It's either Edwin or Edgar. It's something. So I thought, a key part is how there's a romantic interest very quickly established between them. They flirt a bit. He's obviously interested in her. She seems quite coy and interested in him. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how to establish that quickly. Are there any do's and don'ts?
Well, this story doesn't leave any room for doubt. Like, she is quite alluring, and oh, she's such a flirt. I really don't think you can misinterpret it, which is maybe the safest way to do it, because people are notorious at not noticing when people are flirting.
I had this at school. I was like, I was just being friendly, and people were like, why are you so flirting with them? Why are you so flirty?
Yeah, I know that problem well. Like, no, I just want to prove my superiority in conversation. Like, I'm not flirting with you, I just want to win at the banter. But I would say that if you want to have an effective romance, like, I think they established that there's a romantic interest effectively in this story, but I don't think they set up an actual romance, if that makes sense. It's kind of pre-romance in that it could have gone there if we'd spent more time with the characters. But I don't think we quite get to, like, the full-on. There's interest of the romantic or sexual kind, but not, like, a relationship foundation there. So I think if you were looking to quickly establish a romance, which had you rooting for the characters, you'd want to quickly establish the relationship's foundation, aka what do they have in common? Why do they like each other?
Yeah, that makes sense. So in this story, it's not really about, like, we want to, like, marry each other. It's more, hey, you're kind of interesting. You're a mermaid and you live in a lake. That's great.
Yeah, like their foundation is curiosity, her about the world, him about her. And I guess that's also what makes the characters attractive to each other as well, which would be the other part of the romance.
I always think in romances that when you sort of set them up, there's always, like, a reason, or maybe, like, more than one reason why the characters, it might be impractical for the characters to be together, or impossible even. So in this story, it's the fact that, you know, she's a mermaid and he's a human. But in other good romance stories, like, I mean, Pride and Prejudice, it's because Darcy is a jerk, but there's always, like, a reason in that first sort of meeting that they won't or shouldn't get together. And the fun of the story is seeing how they overcome it, or at least that's what I like about romances.
It's a dance between will they, won't they, or, you know, getting closer, drifting further apart. It doesn't necessarily have to be will they, won't they get together, although that is common in romance stories.
It is very common. Also, can they overcome the barriers between them and get together is also, like, quite a good one. So having kind of talked about that a little bit, do either of you have any favourite meetings in romance stories?
The meeting is never my favourite part. I like the bit that's later on, where they're, like, trying to overcome some problem, or the more of the resolution of the character arc is often more memorable to me. Like, the meetings always just seem kind of tacky and cheesy and kind of silly a lot of the time. But I'm not really a romance fan, so I do like romance, but it's not my go-to.
One of my favourite ones is in The Kiss Quotient by Helen Wong. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. And the premise of the story is that there's your main protagonist, Stella. So she's on the autistic spectrum disorder, and she's kind of getting a lot of pressure to have romance and stuff in her life that she's not very good at. So she tackles it scientifically and hires a professional escort, Michael, to kind of teach her how to do it and, like, be romantic and do all the kissing and everything like that. And I really like their first introduction because it doesn't go exactly the way you'd expect it to, and kind of subverts a lot of our romantic expectations. And also, it's one of the first novels I ever came across that explicitly talks about consent.
Yeah, that's a good example. I haven't read that book, but I would like to. It sounds interesting.
Also, Peter Darling by Austin Chant starts with a sword fight, and I'm always a sucker for a sword fight.
Is that romantic?
It turns into a romance, but I'm always happy with an enemies to lovers, so I really don't mind if their first meeting is antagonistic. Also, there's something about a sword fight, it's very intimate.
That sounds like I would enjoy it. Sword fight as, like, a first meeting setup would be quite cool.
Certainly, I prefer that kind of thing to a meet cute.
What's a meet cute, just quickly? Is it when the heroine kind of tumbles into his arms?
Yes.
By accident.
It's an amusing or charming first encounter between the characters, and it's often quite humorous. It happens a lot in sitcoms or romantic comedies. Like, it doesn't have that level of angst involved. It's like, I know, he saves her from drowning. They meet at a coffee
always
shop.
Makes me roll my eyes.
I know, they have to get through some shenanigan together or something like that. Like, they just don't meet like normal people. Like, you know, they don't meet like for a friend of a party. It's just a bit unusual.
They have some kind of almost outside force pushing them into their cuteness. Well, haha, the author. So why does it make you roll your eyes, Matt, then?
I think it just feels overdone, and every romance story has to do it now, or at least it feels like they all feel like they have to do it, if you know what I mean.
It is very embedded in the formula. I think some readers would be disappointed by a lack of meet cute.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, I think romance to me is more about the quieter moments. I like a bit more subtlety involved.
You like the kind of quiet shows of affection rather than the, oh no, I just dropped my keys, whoever can save me kind of thing.
I don't know, it seems so external when romance really should focus on the internal conflicts, in my opinion.
I'm trying to write a romance at the moment, and I'm actually struggling to come up with an external plotline, but I also think that the external plotline is really important to kind of go with the internal. Otherwise, you just have them kind of having conversations in space with nothing to kind of tackle. That's why the meet cute is often important, because it's often involved with the larger external plot, like, say, I don't know, he's her new boss. Oh god, they had a one night stand the night before. How are they dealing with this? It's linked with, like, career goals or something else within the larger kind of spectrum of their world.
Yeah, I mean, it is important to have both kinds of conflict, but I think it's sometimes difficult to make them feel cohesive.
But then that's why you often also have the romantic subplot to a more action-based fantasy story, where they often work quite well. The difference being, I think, the question becoming, how does the romance impact on the plot? So, for example, we're talking about this story being a romance. However, one could argue that if the romantic part of it were taken out, it wouldn't impact the story at all. You could still have the same plot happen with friendship. Like, the romance is not necessarily necessary to the plotline. I mean, a bit more than completely, like, side note, in that they need to be interested in each other for the plot to happen. But
I guess the interest could come from some kind of other angle, but
exactly, and she wants to learn about, like, I know she's a human biologist. Like, you'd get the same plot almost without the romance there.
yeah, you would.
I was gonna say, I think that's what decides if romance is the main genre of a story or not, was what happens if you take the romance out. Does the story still stand?
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know why I zoned in on romance as the key part of this one. I guess because I felt like it was the driving force of the story. But you're right, if you take it out, you could have a similar plot. So,
I mean, let's be honest though, if you took the romance out, it would be not a very good story.
I was just saying I'll find it quite boring.
Yeah, exactly. Romance is also just something I think people like in a lot of stories. It adds an extra layer, which is fun. I mean, there could be other reasons for him to be worried about where's the mermaid gone at the end of the story, but romance is a more endearing version than, marine biologist who lost a project.
Or maybe even someone who's like, well, now the lake is cursed because there's no mermaid. Whatever.
Yeah, and like romance and magic often go hand in hand, so I think it works quite well thematically. Same with you meet someone, you think you're connecting, and then suddenly they disappear of all trace.
Oh, it's like Yodi ghosting.
Yeah, missed connection. So I think you were right to pick up the romance.
That's kind of what I went for in my questions.
I know.
I will say my favourite meetings in romance stories, I've got a shout out to Pride and Prejudice, where Darcy and Lizzie have a very awkward dance and then she hears him insult her. I mean, I didn't think that was going to go well for any of them. So when Jane Austen just turned it around, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
My other favourite ones, I like Stardust always, forever. Gonna keep talking about it, I'm sorry.
So good though.
He goes looking for a fallen star, finds Yvain, who's like, get out of here. Don't tie me up and drag me back as a favour to your fiance. And I find that one quite fun as well. So I think that you can do some really interesting things in first meetings, and the reason I brought it up is I think it gets underused sometimes. It's easy to write like the meet cute, but you could write some more, I guess, impactful scenes. What I'm saying is, be original.
Yeah.
You can do a lot with it. This one, I feel like it tried. I liked the flirting. I feel like it happened quickly, but it's a short story, so it's okay. And I just think there's something always awesome about the image of some sort of supernatural creature and a human together. That, I don't know, there's always something interesting about that.
There is,
and
yeah.
The potential that can go wrong with it.
Quickly before we move off meetings, what we kind of haven't covered is like friends to lovers, for example, where you open your story with the characters having already met. in which point I would kind of shift the focus from first meeting of the two people to what is the first time you show them within your text would kind of have the same impact.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't read enough of Friends to Lovers. I seem to always end up on either just straight up strangers or enemies to lovers. I think it's a bit of a rarer one, unless I'm just behind on reading, as always. Okay, so, I mean, I thought this plan to, take the mermaid out in a car was really brilliant, and probably nothing was going to go wrong with it. Did you agree? What did you think might go wrong?
Well, I think this is kind of clever. There's this red herring I think it's a red herring, where she says she has to be back before sunrise. And it seems really obvious that it's this kind of Cinderella-esque twist where she's going to get so wrapped up in her car journey, she's going to miss it, and then she's going to turn into a pumpkin or something.
I thought she might turn into some kind of monster.
Or be stuck in one form or another.
So I thought it was quite interesting when it actually didn't really go down that route, and instead we have this guy just drives over a rock like an idiot.
He's too distracted. There's a mermaid in his car. I would be quite distracted if there was a mermaid in my car.
I found that quite frustrating in the story just because I tend to like my endings to be informed by the characters and their actions. Rock seems like an act of God.
I thought it seemed a little bit odd because, I mean, it wouldn't be great if I drove over a rock, but my car probably wouldn't, explode or anything, like they seem to think theirs is going to. I assume this is something about old cars. But yeah, it does feel a little bit random. I can see what you mean.
Their choices didn't lead to the ending. Maybe the mermaid's and that she tries to vanish or whatever, but...
I don't know, I kind of think life is like that, though. Sometimes some idiot god or something just drops a rock in your way and you're like, well, there's nothing I can do now.
That's why I don't want fiction to be like that.
Yeah, that is fair enough.
I think it's quite interesting that even though the sunrise clause doesn't come into effect, it's still in the story.
The hanging thread, isn't it? Because you never quite know what it means.
I think it's necessary because it helps you realise that something is going to go horribly wrong. It builds the tension, which I think is much needed, I think is why it's there.
Well spotted.
I just think that's interesting because you don't usually see that kind of red herring switcheroo kind of take on it very much.
No, it usually comes into play in some fashion. That's kind of why I was wondering about the ending, whether she just went to another river or whether she died because she wasn't back by sunrise. I guess that's kind of a depressing reading of the story, though. Makes quite something that's quite tonally light and silly a bit too horrible for me.
Yeah, I mean, they had to build some tension, but the tone of the story is so light that you know that probably nothing is going to go horribly wrong.
She's probably fine. She really just didn't want to go back to a lake full of weirdos.
He knows where she lives now.
She does mention, she likes a change of scenery or something at the beginning of the story where she sits in a different place. So maybe she just went for a little holiday.
Or it could just be that she doesn't let anyone see her anymore.
Okay, so my next question is, how do you feel about the end of the story? Which is good, because we were just talking about it. So did you feel satisfied by it? Were you annoyed with it? What did you think about it?
It's very open-ended. But I think that's fine because she's clearly such a mysterious being in the first place. It kind of makes sense that, we don't know where she came from, we don't know where she went. It's kind of circular, right?
I think I wished that we did know where she went. I just like things to be spelt out. But maybe having, multiple interpretations is a good thing as well.
But, I mean, it's just... I feel like if you did, it would just be kind of a weak ending. Like, oh, yeah, so now she lives in this waterfall instead. Like, oh,
what was the point of all this? Yeah, I can see what you mean. She could have just gone to live in the waterfall without going for a jaunt in the car or whatever. How did you feel about it, Simone?
Like I think I mentioned, I found it quite frustrating that it felt like the characters didn't, or at least the protagonist, didn't really input on the ending. It was out of his control. And yes, that mimics life, and some things are out of our control. But in such a short story, it would have been nice to feel like the ending was in some way caused by him. And yes, it was in the sense that, he put her in a tank in the car, but also... I don't know, it felt a bit like act of God.
Yeah, you think the protagonist was a bit weak?
Yeah, he didn't do anything. What was his goal?
Get it on with a mermaid?
It's not like he even messed up, saying something wrong to her or anything.
You're right, he didn't really make a mistake in terms of saying she had legs, which he almost does earlier in the story, or something like that. He just overestimates the ability of his friend.
Yeah, it'd be one thing if he was the one driving. Or, if you're setting up a gasoline explosion in your car, least you can do is have them, like a dashing rescue or a tragic rescue or something. Like, the car was completely fine.
Yeah, they seem fine after. They just seem a bit annoyed that the mermaid is gone. Okay, last question then. Would you consider, if you met a nice mermaid and she had a nice chat with you and you liked her, would you consider taking her on a date? Like, maybe not in a car, maybe in like a wheelchair with a tank on it or something. Or maybe in a car, I don't know. Would you do it?
Absolutely.
There are some practical limitations here.
I mean,
That aside, I guess it might be fun.
it depends where you're meeting. If you're meeting on the seaside, you can all have lots of dates swimming in the sea with her all summer. Summer romance.
That could be fun.
Or maybe you're an Olympic swimmer and you just chill in your big pool or something. Get stuck on a desert island with her. Take her in a wheelbarrow to the fair. Like,
just be like, yeah, I'll install a swimming pool for you, it'll be fine. I've never really seen any creative ways around your spouse being a mermaid. It's always, oh, one of us is going to turn into a mermaid or one of us is going to turn into a human. It's so dramatic. No one's ever thought of a more simple solution or a complicated solution that involves less impossible magic.
Monster I saw had them living in a bathtub.
Okay, that sounds like it would not be very fun for the mermaid.
I don't think it was a long-term solution.
No. I've got to put some more thought into this.
I think you'd need it to be kind of like take place on a coastal town so both characters maintain their agency.
Yeah.
If you live near a large body of water, rent is so high.
Are there any further thoughts anybody wishes to add about this story?
I like that his friend was skeptical.
Wouldn't you be? You'd just be like, oh yeah, sure, you can have my car to see your mermaid friend.
I agree.
Definitely supervise anyone who wanted to take my car for such a purpose, and definitely anyone who wanted to put a tank of water in it. That doesn't sound good for the car. But yeah, his friend was quite interesting because, it might have been a complication, but then it wasn't, so it was fine.
Yeah, other than him, hitting a rock.
Yeah, other than his shoddy driving skills.
I guess he's there as proof that it wasn't just in the character's imagination.
That makes sense. Okay, so usually I would talk about the writer a bit. So Charles Weathers Bump. I could not really find anything about him. To the point where I wondered if this was a pseudonym. All I could find about him was that he was an American journalist, which was listed on one of the kind of sites that index books. He doesn't have a wiki page. He doesn't have I googled biography and I could find nothing. I googled him in quotes and all that came up was a couple of short story collections. Really could not find anything about this guy. So he's a mystery. I wish I could inform you. If any of our listeners are better informed about Charles Weathers Bump and know a bit more about him, his life, then can you please comment on our website and tell me, enlighten me, because I couldn't find anything. And I like to think that I am pretty good with Google, being a tech support person, but I could seriously find really not much.
I know a bit about him. I know, like you say, he used to be a journalist, but then he met a mermaid and went for a swim, and he was never seen again.
Oh my god! That's why there's nothing on Google. He disappeared and became non-Googleable. Now I need to work out how to do that. Alright, well, in that case, we'll finish the episode there. So, thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.